My family threw me out of my own house on Christmas Eve. In front of 20 relatives, my son looked me in the eye and said, "Apologize to my wife for your disgusting behavior, then get out of this house." His wife stood beside him crying over a missing diamond necklace while everyone stared at me like I was a thief. So I quietly walked out into the snow alone. But what they didn't know was that before sunrise, the very door they locked behind me would become the one they desperately wished I would walk back through. I am grateful you stayed, genuinely. Now tell me something. Where are you watching from right now, city, country, time zone? Drop it in the comments. You would be surprised how far this reaches. Fair warning, some details in this story were shaped for narrative and educational purposes. Names and settings are fictional, but the lesson inside it is one I hope you carry with you. The porch swing creaked on the left side the moment I sat down. It always did. For 35 years, that swing had made the same tired complaint every time someone settled into it, a low, drawn-out groan from the left hinge that Edward swore he would fix every single spring, and never once did. I used to press my lips together to keep from smiling whenever he said it. This weekend, Nadine. I'll get to it this weekend. And then the weekend would come and go, and the swing would creak, and Edward would look at it with that particular expression he had half embarrassed, half unbothered, and say, "Next time." There was no next time. Not for the swing, not for a lot of things. I sat on that porch on the last night of the year with a cup of tea gone cold in my hands, watching snow fall over Olmsted Lane. The street was empty. Every house on the block had its lights burning warm behind curtained windows. Families gathered inside for the countdown, children already drowsy on the couch. I could hear faintly someone's television through the wall of the house across the street. But out here, there was only the cold and the quiet, and the sound of that creak when I shifted my weight. I had lived in this house for 35 years. I knew every sound it made. I set the cold tea on the railing and looked out at the front yard. The snow had covered the old maple completely, just a white shape, now soft and formless in the dark. Edward had planted that tree the year we moved in, 1989, the summer before Garrett was born. He had dug the hole himself on a Saturday afternoon in July, sweating through his shirt, insisting he didn't need help. I had stood on this same porch, watching him, and thought with the particular certainty of someone deeply in love that I had never seen anything more ridiculous or more dear in my entire life. That was a long time ago. Edward Holbrook had been my husband for 28 years. He was a quiet man, steady in the way that certain people are not dramatic about it. Not performing calmness, just genuinely built from something solid that the world had not managed to wear down. He worked as a civil engineer for Fairfield County for 30 years, came home every evening at the same time, cooked dinner on Thursdays, because he said it was only fair, and loved this house the way some people love a living thing. He knew which floorboard squeaked in the upstairs hallway. He knew the exact angle you had to hold the back door handle to keep it from sticking in the winter. He knew everything about this place. When he died in March of 2019, I sat in this house for 3 days before I could bring myself to change out of the clothes I had worn to the hospital. Not because I was paralyzed. I have never been the kind of woman who goes still under pressure. But because the house was so full of him still, the smell of his coffee in the kitchen, the indentation his shoulders had made in the back of the living room armchair over 20 years of reading, the left hinge on that porch swing waiting patiently for a repair that was never going to come now. He left behind one thing I had not yet been able to open. It was a plain white envelope sealed sitting in the small fireproof safe in our bedroom closet, his handwriting on the front large, slightly unsteady, because he had written it during treatment when his hands were not entirely his own. The words read, "For Nadine. Open when you need it most." I had moved that envelope 3 times in 5 years. Once when I reorganized the closet, once when the safe needed a new battery, once when I simply took it out and held it for a while, turned it over in my hands, and then put it back without opening it. Every time something stopped me. Some feeling that the moment was not yet right, that I had not yet arrived at the moment Edward had written it for. I was beginning to understand that I had been wrong about when that moment would come. This past September, I turned 60 years old. My financial advisor, a careful and thorough man named Douglas Pruitt, who had managed my retirement account since Edward passed, called me on a Tuesday morning to let me know that I had reached the age at which I could access my retirement savings without penalty. Under IRS rules, withdrawals from a traditional IRA before age 59 and a half carry a 10% early withdrawal penalty on top of regular income taxes. At 60, that penalty disappears entirely. It was Douglas said a door that had just opened. "You've been disciplined about this for decades, Nadine," he told me. "You have real options now." I told him I wanted to think about it. I spent 2 weeks thinking about it. And then I called him back and told him I wanted to withdraw $163,000. He was quiet for a moment. "That's the bulk of the account." "I know what it is," I said. "Can I ask what for?" "The house," I told him. "I want to restore the house." There was a pause on the line, the kind where a careful professional is deciding whether to say the thing he is thinking or the thing that is his job to say. He chose the latter. "I'll process the paperwork this week." I did not tell him that I had another reason, that 60 had felt on the morning I woke up to it like a door of a different kind, the kind that closes behind you whether you are ready or not, the kind that makes you look around at what you have built and ask yourself honestly whether any of it was built to last. The house had needed work for years: the kitchen tile, the porch siding, the fireplace in the living room that Edward had talked about restoring since the mid-90s. I had been putting it off the way you put off things that feel too large to face alone. But that September, something shifted in me. I thought about Christmas, about the smell of pine and wood smoke, about a table full of people and food made from scratch, and the particular joy of a house that has been cared for. I thought about Edward sitting in that armchair and Garrett coming through the front door with his coat dusted with snow, and all of us together in this place that had held us for so long. I hired a contractor the first week of October. The work took 2 months. I chose every detail myself: the paint color for the living room walls, the new tile for the kitchen backsplash, the restored brass hardware for the front door. I called Garrett once to ask whether Vivian had a preference for the living room color, thinking it would be a kind gesture, thinking it would make her feel welcome. "She'll probably want to redecorate anyway, Mom," he said. "Don't overthink it." I remember holding the phone after he hung up, looking at the paint swatches spread across the kitchen table. I told myself he was just being casual, that it did not mean what it sounded like, that I was overthinking it exactly as he had said. Standing on this porch on the last night of December, listening to the swing creak in the cold, I understood something I had not understood then. Garrett had not been careless with those words. He had known exactly what he was saying. He just hadn't expected me to still be standing here to understand it. I stepped back inside and walked through the front hallway into the living room. The renovation crew had finished the first week of December, just 3 weeks before Christmas. Standing here now, in the quiet of the last night of the year, I could still smell the faint trace of fresh paint underneath the pine scent of the Christmas tree I had not yet taken down. The walls were the color I had chosen myself, a warm ivory that caught the light from the fireplace and made the whole room feel like something out of a memory. The original hardwood floors had been sanded and refinished to a deep honey color. The fireplace, which Edward and I had talked about restoring for the better part of 2 decades, had finally been rebuilt with the original brick pattern, intact new mortar, new firebox, the old cast iron mantel cleaned and polished until it shone. It was the most beautiful the house had ever looked, and not one person who walked through that door on Christmas Eve had said so. I ran my hand along the mantel, now feeling the smooth iron under my fingertips. I had spent 11 weeks making choices: grout color hardware, finish crown molding profile the exact width of the baseboards. 11 weeks of contractors and paint chips, and Saturday mornings at the tile shop on Ethan Allen Highway in Danbury, holding samples up to the light and trying to imagine how they would look come December. I had done all of it alone, which did not bother me. I had been doing most things alone for 5 years. What bothered me, what I could feel sitting heavy in my chest even now, was how certain I had been that it would matter, that all of it would matter to someone other than me. I remembered the morning I called Garrett to ask about the living room color. It had been a Wednesday in late October, one of those gray Connecticut mornings when the sky sits low and the leaves have mostly come down and everything smells like cold dirt and wood smoke. I had the paint swatches spread across the kitchen table, 7 shades of white and ivory and warm gray, and I'd been staring at them for 20 minutes trying to decide whether to go lighter or warmer. It occurred to me that Vivian might have an opinion. She had always struck me as someone with opinions about interiors. I thought asking might be a gesture of inclusion, a way of saying, this is your home too when you visit. Come and feel welcome here. I dialed Garrett's number. He picked up on the 3rd ring. Hey, Mom. His voice had that particular flatness it got when he was multitasking. Not rude exactly, but not fully present either. I could hear keyboard clicks in the background, the ambient noise of his office at the law firm in Stamford. I'm choosing the living room color, I told him. I thought Vivian might want to weigh in. Does she have a preference? Warm tones, cool tones, anything she particularly likes or can't stand? There was a pause. Not a long one, just a beat like a small calculation happening somewhere behind his words. Then he said, she'll probably want to redecorate anyway, Mom. Don't overthink it. My hand tightened slightly around the phone. What does that mean? It just means she has her own taste, he said, and the keyboard clicks resumed. You know how she is. Just pick whatever you like. It looks fine either way. I almost said something then. I could feel the question forming, what exactly do you mean she'll redecorate? Redecorate what? This is my house, Garrett. But I swallowed it. I told myself I was being sensitive, that he was distracted and chose his words carelessly, the way busy people sometimes do. I thanked him for his time and hung up and chose the ivory, the warmer of the 2 finalists, because I liked it and because it reminded me of the color the kitchen had been when Edward and I first moved in. Standing in this room, now looking at the walls I had painted and the floor I had refinished and the fireplace I had restored, I understood that Garrett had not been distracted when he said those words. He had been precise. He had known in October that the house would not be mine much longer, or at least that was what he had planned. What he had not planned for was me. The thing about Garrett that most people did not understand, that I, his own mother, had spent years not fully allowing myself to understand, was that he had always been gifted at presenting one version of himself while operating from an entirely different one. As a child, he had been the boy who remembered to hold doors open for elderly neighbors and brought his teacher a card on the last day of school, and who also quietly, systematically found ways to get exactly what he wanted without anyone noticing the effort it had taken. I had called it drive. I had called it ambition. I had told Edward more than once that Garrett's focus was going to take him far. Edward had listened to me say those things and nodded, and I had not until recently thought carefully enough about the expression on his face when he did. He had graduated from UConn School of Law, passed the Connecticut bar on his first attempt, and joined a mid-size firm in Stamford that specialized in financial litigation. He was by every external measure a success. He had a beautiful wife, a beautiful apartment in Stamford, a salary that allowed him to wear good suits, and drive a car that did not need repairs. He called me on my birthday and on Christmas and occasionally on a random Tuesday. And when he called, he asked about the house and about my health and about whether I'd been getting out enough, and he sounded every single time like a devoted son. I believed it because I needed to believe it. That is the only honest answer I have. What I did not know I was only beginning to piece together as I stood in this renovated living room on the last night of December, was that while I had been choosing paint colors and fireplace tile through October and November, Garrett had been having a very different kind of meeting. 40 miles south of Ridgefield, in a commercial office building on Broad Street in Bridgeport, Connecticut, a man named Thomas Briggs operated a small document services business. He was not a licensed notary. He was not a licensed anything, as it turned out. But he had for several years been providing a particular service to particular clients, the kind of service that involved official-looking seals and signatures on documents that needed to appear legitimate without actually being so. Garrett had found him. I do not know how. I do not know all the details of what passed between them or exactly when the first conversation happened or how many times they met. What I know is that by the time I was standing in the tile shop in Danbury, holding grout samples up to the fluorescent light, the plan was already in motion. And sitting beside Garrett at that first meeting, according to what came out later, was a woman named Donna Faye Lester. She was a distant cousin on my mother's side, a woman in her early 50s who had been coming to family Christmases for as long as I could remember, who always brought a green bean casserole and always asked after my health, and always sat in the corner of the living room with a small, pleasant smile on her face. I had never thought of her as anything other than harmless background noise. I had been wrong about that too. The kitchen still smelled like cinnamon. I noticed it the moment I pushed through the swinging door from the hallway, that warm, faintly sweet trace that had soaked into the curtains and the dish towels and the grout between the backsplash tiles during the weeks of holiday baking. It was the smell of effort, of anticipation, of a woman who had spent 3 days making pies and cookies and a cranberry bread from a recipe handwritten on an index card by Edward's mother, because she had believed genuinely and completely that the people coming through her front door deserved that kind of welcome. On the kitchen table sat a ceramic plate with 6 shortbread cookies, still arranged in a careful half circle. Nobody had touched them. I had put them out at 4 in the afternoon on Christmas Eve as a small gesture, something for Garrett and Vivian to find when they arrived, a little thing to say I thought of you before you even walked in. They had walked right past them. Vivian had glanced at the plate the way you glance at furniture in a waiting room, registering its existence without assigning it any value, and said nothing. I picked up one of the cookies now. It was stale, the butter flavor gone flat, the edges soft in the wrong way. I ate it anyway. Some stubbornness in me refused to throw them out just yet. It had been shortly after 3 in the afternoon when Garrett's car turned into the driveway on Christmas Eve. I had been watching for it from the kitchen window, wiping my hands on my apron every few minutes, for no reason the way you do when nervous energy has nowhere useful to go. I heard the tires on the gravel first, then saw the headlights sweeping across the garage door. I untied my apron, hung it on the hook beside the refrigerator, and went to stand in the front doorway. The cold hit me immediately, that particular Connecticut cold that carries real weight in late December, the kind that presses against your face and finds the gap between your collar and your jaw. I stood in it anyway because I wanted Garrett to see me there when he got out of the car. I wanted him to see his mother standing in the doorway of the house she had spent 4 months preparing for this exact moment. Garrett climbed out of the driver's side first. He was wearing a charcoal wool coat I had not seen before, well-cut, expensive-looking, the kind of thing that read as effortlessly polished from 20 feet away. He gave me a brief smile and raised one hand in a half-wave, not a wave of someone who had been looking forward to seeing their mother, more the wave of someone acknowledging a familiar landmark on a road they had driven many times. Then the passenger door opened and Vivian stepped out. I want to be fair when I describe Vivian Stark. She was objectively a striking woman, tall with the kind of angular bone structure that photographs well and ages, slowly dark hair pulled back in a way that managed to look both casual and deliberate. She was wearing a coat trimmed at the collar and cuffs with what appeared to be genuine fur, ivory-colored, brushed, smooth and large sunglasses, despite the fact that the sky was the flat matte gray of a Connecticut December afternoon, with no sun anywhere in evidence. She pulled a rolling suitcase behind her across my freshly shoveled front walk, the wheels catching on a seam in the brick, and she glanced up at the front of the house with an expression I recognized immediately. It was the expression of someone calculating, not admiring, not taking in a place with warmth or curiosity, or even simple acknowledgement. She looked at my house the way an appraiser looks at a property, quickly, efficiently filing information into categories of value and deficiency. Her gaze moved from the roofline to the new front door hardware to the porch railing I had repainted in October, and something in her expression settled into a faint, composed neutrality that was worse somehow than open disapproval. "Smaller than I remembered," she said, and though she said it to Garrett rather than to me, her voice carried perfectly in the cold air. My stomach tightened. I kept my face pleasant and open and said, "Vivian, it's so good to have you both here. Come inside, it's freezing." Garrett put his hand briefly on the small of her back and guided her up the front steps. He kissed my cheek when he passed me a quick, dutiful press of lips that I felt more as an absence than a presence, the ghost of a greeting, rather than the thing itself. "Hey, Mom, house looks good," he said and walked inside. I stood in the doorway for one extra moment, breathing the cold air, telling myself it's fine. People are tired from the drive. Give them time to settle in. It's Christmas Eve. It is going to be fine. I followed them inside. What happened over the next 2 hours was not technically a series of large events. Nothing dramatic was said, No one raised a voice. It was instead a sustained and methodical erosion, the kind of damage that is done not by a single blow, but by the accumulation of small ones, each individually dismissible, collectively devastating. Vivian moved through the house the way a building inspector moves through a property noting deficiencies. The kitchen cabinets were in her assessment dated. She touched one door and let it swing closed with a soft click that somehow communicated volumes. The living room rug was, she observed to Garrett, while I was standing 8 feet away refilling the water pitcher, very provincial. When she spotted the Christmas tree I had spent an afternoon decorating with ornaments collected over 35 years, glass balls and wooden figures, and a small ceramic angel that had belonged to Edward's grandmother, she tilted her head slightly and said, "Oh, you went artificial. Practical, I suppose." Each time I said nothing. Each time Garrett said nothing, either did not redirect the conversation, did not offer a counterpoint, did not so much as clear his throat. He simply stood beside his wife and let her words settle into the room like a slow leak, and I watched his face for some flicker of discomfort or apology, and found nothing there. I went back into the kitchen at one point to check on the bread warming in the oven, and I stood at the counter with both hands flat on the cool granite and took 3 slow breaths. My eyes burned in the way they do before tears come, and I blinked hard against it because I was not going to cry in my own kitchen over a comment about a Christmas tree. I was 60 years old. I had buried a husband and raised a son and renovated an entire house with my own retirement savings. I was not going to stand here and fall apart over this, but my hands were pressing harder into that granite than they needed to. By the time the rest of the family began arriving at 5 cousins and second cousins and the particular cluster of people who show up to every holiday gathering and whose exact relationship to you has blurred over the years into simply family, I had packed my hurt carefully into a small, tight place somewhere behind my sternum and closed a door over it. I set out the appetizers. I freshened the flowers on the dining table. I answered the door 6 times with a genuine smile because seeing Rosalind's face come through it, my younger sister 3 years behind me, wearing her good red sweater and carrying a bottle of wine and a pecan pie, made something in my chest loosen with relief. Rosalind Mercer had been my closest friend since before either of us knew what that meant. She stepped inside, handed me the wine and the pie, and looked at me with those sharp, perceptive eyes of hers that have always been able to read me faster than I can compose myself. "You okay?" she asked quietly while the noise of arriving guests swirled around us. I smiled and said, "Ask me again at midnight." She held my gaze for a beat longer than the question required, and I saw her file the answer away in that careful way she had. Then someone called her name from across the room and she was gone, and I was back in the current of the evening, moving and hosting and offering drinks, while somewhere behind me, Vivienne accepted a glass of sparkling water and told a cousin she had never met before about a restaurant in Florence where the pasta was genuinely life-changing. I thought about the shortbread cookies sitting untouched on the kitchen table. I thought something is wrong here. Something beyond rudeness and beyond incompatibility and beyond the ordinary friction of family. Something is wrong in a way I cannot yet name. I should have listened to that thought sooner. The dining room table was still set the way I had left it. I had not been able to bring myself to strip it down completely. The cream linen tablecloth, the pine and eucalyptus centerpiece I had arranged the morning of Christmas Eve, the white taper candles burned down to uneven stubs. There were dark wax drips on the cloth near the center, the kind that set permanently if you do not catch them in time. I had not caught them in time. I stood in the doorway now and looked at the whole arrangement, beautiful once ruined, quietly still holding the shape of what it had been, and felt something move through my chest that I did not have a clean word for. 20 people had sat around this table on Christmas Eve. 20 people had watched what happened, and not one of them had stood up. I pulled out the chair nearest to me. The one closest to the kitchen door, the one I always sat in at family gatherings, because it allowed me to get up easily when something needed refilling or adjusting, because I was always the one doing the refilling and adjusting, and I sat down. The chair legs scraped against the hardwood with a sound that seemed very loud in the empty house. Dinner had begun at 6:30. I had timed everything carefully. The turkey had rested the full 30 minutes. The mashed potatoes were made from scratch Yukon Golds with real butter and warm cream, the way Edward had always liked them. I had made a green bean casserole from his mother's handwritten recipe, which called for a full can of cream of mushroom soup and crispy onions on top, and was not sophisticated by any measure, but was the taste of every good Christmas I had ever known. I had set everything out on the table in the good serving dishes, the white ceramic ones with the blue rim that had been a wedding gift 32 years ago and had survived every move and every holiday since. Nobody mentioned the food, not once the entire meal. Vivian sat to Garrett's right, close enough that their shoulders occasionally touched her posture, impeccable in the way of someone who had been trained to sit that way rather than someone who simply felt comfortable. She had changed into a dark green dress for dinner, understated and clearly expensive, and she wore at her throat a necklace I had not noticed before, a fine platinum chain with what appeared to be a substantial diamond pendant that caught the candlelight every time she moved. I would come to know that necklace very well before the night was over. The conversation around the table had the particular texture of large family gatherings, loud in patches, quiet in others, multiple threads running simultaneously, children's voices cutting across adult ones. A cousin's daughter knocked over a glass of sparkling cider near the far end of the table, and there was a brief flurry of napkins and apologies and good-natured laughter. Garrett's second cousin Gerald, a good-natured man in his mid-50s who sold insurance in Danbury and had been coming to these gatherings since before I could remember, was telling a long story about a fishing trip that kept threatening to arrive at a punchline and never quite did. People were laughing anyway. It should have felt warm. It should have felt like exactly what I had spent 4 months and $163,000 trying to create. Instead, I felt like a caterer at someone else's party. Vivian did not eat the green bean casserole. She spooned a small portion onto her plate and moved it to one side with the careful efficiency of someone managing an inconvenience. When the cousin to her left, a cheerful woman named Charlene Mobley, a retired schoolteacher in her late 40s who'd been attending Holbrook family Christmases for 20 years and who documented every gathering she attended with the thoroughness of an archivist, asked whether she had tried the turkey. Vivian smiled the kind of smile that never quite reaches the eyes and said, "It's lovely. Very traditional. Very traditional." I was sitting 7 feet away. I heard every word. Charlene Mobley, bless her, did not appear to register the particular weight of that phrase. She was already reaching for her phone, a Samsung in a floral case, that she set on her lap with the practiced ease of someone who has been discreetly filming family events for years. Charlene filmed everything. Birthdays, anniversaries, the first day of school for any child in the extended family who would hold still long enough. She had sent me a video she had taken at my 50th birthday dinner that I had watched 4 times because it captured Edward laughing at something. Someone said off camera, his head thrown back completely unguarded, and I had not seen him laugh like that in the years before he got sick. I had never thought to be grateful for Charlene's habit until this night, but I am getting ahead of myself. Rosalind was seated to my left. At some point during the main course, her hand found mine under the table and squeezed once firmly and then let go. She did not say anything. She did not need to. That one squeeze said, "I see what is happening. I see you sitting here maintaining your dignity while someone dismantles it piece by piece, and I want you to know that I see it." My throat tightened so sharply that I had to take a slow sip of water and stare at the centerpiece for a moment before I trusted myself to continue eating. At the other end of the table, I noticed Donna Faye Lester sitting very still. Donna Faye was a distant cousin on my mother's side, a quiet woman who had been a fixture at these gatherings for as long as I could remember, always in the same category of presence, reliable, unobtrusive, the kind of person you are genuinely glad is there without ever thinking too hard about why. She always brought a green bean casserole, actually, which meant there were 2 on the table this year, and mine had been touched by exactly no one. She always asked about the house, about my health, about whether I had been sleeping well. Tonight she had not spoken to me once. She sat with her eyes mostly on her plate, cutting her food into small pieces and bringing them to her mouth with a focused attention that struck me even then as slightly off. Not rude, not hostile, just absent. Like a woman who had decided for reasons of her own to take up as little space as possible tonight and draw as little attention as possible to the fact that she was here at all. I made a mental note of it the way you make mental notes of things that do not yet have an explanation. filed it somewhere, and moved on because there were dishes to pass and glasses to refill and the performance of normalcy to maintain. Garrett spoke perhaps 4 times during dinner, once to answer a question about a case he was working on, deflecting with the smooth vagueness of someone who has learned to sound informative while saying nothing, once to ask someone to pass the rolls, once to laugh at Gerald's fishing story which had finally arrived at its punchline, and once when a cousin asked Vivienne where they had vacationed that past summer, to say, "We did Tuscany in July." Vivienne found this incredible little place outside Siena. Vivienne leaned forward slightly and took over the story from there, describing the villa and the food and the wine and the particular quality of light in the Tuscan countryside at dusk. She spoke well. She was whatever else she was, a genuinely compelling conversationalist when she chose to be with the gift of making the person she was addressing feel like the most important audience in the room. The table turned toward her. Even the children quieted slightly. I watched Garrett watching her. There was something in his expression that I had been reading for years as devotion and was only now beginning to wonder about. It was not quite adoration. It was something more like vigilance, the look of a man who has learned to monitor a situation closely and respond to small signals quickly. The look of someone managing something rather than loving it. I was still thinking about that look when the candles had burned down to their current uneven stubs and the serving dishes had been mostly emptied and people had begun pushing back their chairs and drifting toward the living room with their coffee cups and their eggnog. I gathered plates. I carried them to the kitchen. I stacked them beside the sink. And somewhere in the living room behind me, the evening was about to change in a way that none of us, except I, would later understand 2 people at that table had seen coming. The armchair by the fireplace still held the shape of where I had been sitting. I noticed it when I came back from the kitchen, that slight compression in the cushion, the armrests worn smooth from years of use. Edward had picked out this chair at an estate sale in Wilton the summer after we moved in a wide, deep-seated thing, upholstered in a dark green fabric that had faded gradually over the decades to something softer and more complicated like the color of a forest in November. It had been his reading chair first. After he died, it became mine, the way a lot of things had transferred between us without ceremony simply by the logic of absence. I sat down in it now and looked at the fireplace. The logs I had laid on Christmas Eve were long cold, reduced to gray ash, and the occasional dark shape of what had been wood. I had not lit a fire since that night, had not felt like it. It had been shortly after 8 in the evening when the dishes were cleared, and the family had spread through the house in the way that families do after a large meal, some in the living room with their coffee, some in the den where someone had turned on a football game, a cluster of younger cousins congregating near the stairs. The candles were burning low. The Christmas tree lights blinked their slow, steady rhythm. By any external measure, it looked exactly like a good holiday evening in a warm and well-loved home. I was standing near the fireplace close to the armchair when Vivienne's voice cut through the room. It did not start as a scream. It started as something sharper and more precise than that a single high declarative note that silenced every other conversation in the house within 2 seconds. The kind of sound a person makes when they have decided that what comes next requires an audience. "My necklace," she said. "It's gone." The room reconfigured itself around her instantly. Heads turned. Conversations dropped mid-sentence. Vivienne had her Louis Vuitton bag open on the couch cushion beside her, a structured dark brown leather piece that I knew cost more than my first car, and she was pulling items out of it one by one and setting them on the cushion with a mounting, theatrical urgency. Her wallet, her phone case, a small leather card holder, a tube of hand cream, a folded silk scarf. It was right here, she said, her voice climbing, now acquiring a tremor that struck me even then as slightly too well-timed. "In this bag. I put it in here before dinner because I didn't want to wear it at the table, and it was right here, and now it's gone." The room had gone very quiet. I could hear the football game from the den muffled through the wall, the announcer's voice, a distant murmur beneath the sudden stillness in the living room. Vivienne looked up from the bag. She looked directly at me. Not a glance. Not a sweep of the room that happened to include me. A direct, deliberate, sustained look, the kind that carries a conclusion already reached, that is not searching for an answer, but announcing one. "That necklace is worth $47,000, she said. Her voice had gone very level now, the tremor replaced by something colder and more controlled. "Someone in this room took it." My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I became intensely aware of my own hands where they were, what they were doing, whether they looked like the hands of a guilty person or an innocent one. They were at my sides. They felt enormous and conspicuous and completely wrong wherever I put them. "Vivienne," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. "I don't know what happened to your necklace, but I can assure you that nobody in this family would—" "You were standing right here," she said, cutting across me cleanly. "When I set my bag down, you were right here." The heat rose in my face so fast it surprised me. Not embarrassment. Fury. Clean, white-hot, entirely justified fury that I had absolutely no safe outlet for in this room, in this moment, in front of these 20 people who were watching me with the cautious, uncertain expressions of people witnessing something they do not want to be involved in. I was standing in my own living room, I said, in my own home, which I have owned for 35 years. "Nadine," Garrett's voice came from somewhere behind Vivian's left shoulder. I looked at him. My son. 32 years old, broad-shouldered, wearing a suit jacket he had not bothered to take off all evening because it completed an image he was performing for this room. I looked at his face, and I looked for something, for the smallest indication that he knew this was wrong, that he was about to say something that would stop this, that the child I had raised had driven to soccer practice and stayed up late, helping with college applications, and loved with a ferocity I had never once doubted was about to stand up. His jaw was tight. His eyes moved from my face to Vivian's and back. And then he took one step forward. Just one. But it was a step toward her, not toward me. He positioned himself slightly in front of her, close enough that his shoulder nearly blocked her from view, and crossed his arms over his chest. "Let's all just take a breath," he said. But he was not looking at Vivian when he said it. He was looking at me. The message was not subtle. He had decided in that single step which side of this he was on. He had not asked Vivian to lower her voice or reconsider her accusation. He had not said, "Mom, of course you didn't." He had placed himself between his wife and any consequence and pointed the management of the situation at me. My vision blurred slightly at the edges. I blinked hard against it. I would not cry here. I would not give this room that. Rosalind made a sound across the room, a sharp intake of breath, half-syllable, the beginning of something forceful. I found her eyes and shook my head, barely a movement, just enough. "Not yet. Please, not yet." Donna Fay sat perfectly still in her chair near the window, her coffee cup held in both hands, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere near the floor. She had the careful, composed expression of someone who had known exactly what was coming, and had decided long before tonight that she would not intervene when it arrived. The necklace was gone. Vivian was crying now, real seeming tears, impressive in their timing, rolling down her face with a photogenic precision that I would have found admirable in another context. Garrett had his hand on her back. 20 people were looking at me, and I was standing in my own living room in my own house on Christmas Eve, being looked at like a thief. The front door had a brass handle that Edward had installed himself the summer of 2003. I remembered the afternoon clearly. He had spent 3 hours on it consulting the instruction sheet with the focused patience he brought to all things mechanical, occasionally muttering something under his breath when a screw refused to cooperate, until finally the handle was seated correctly and the door swung on its hinges with a smooth, satisfying weight. He had opened and closed it 6 times after that, testing it, and then looked at me with the expression of a man who has completed something he is quietly proud of. I had laughed and told him it was just a door handle. He had said that a door handle was not just anything, it was the first thing people touched when they came into your home, and it ought to feel solid. I stood with my hand on that handle now on the last night of the year, and I thought about how right he had been about that. The argument, if you could call it that, since an argument requires at least 2 people willing to engage honestly, had continued for approximately 12 minutes after Vivian made her accusation. I know because I watched the clock on the mantel without meaning, to the way you fix on something small and ordinary when the larger thing happening around you is too large to take in all at once. 12 minutes. The length of time it took for my son to stand in the center of my living room and say things to me that I will carry for the rest of my life. He had started quietly. That was the part that surprised me most, not the words themselves, but the composure with which he delivered them. I had half expected anger, or at least the performance of anger, some heat that might suggest an internal conflict. There was none. His voice was measured and deliberate, the voice of a man who had rehearsed this, who had turned these sentences over in his mind enough times that they had lost whatever emotional charge they might once have carried. "Mom," he said, "I think you need to apologize." I stared at him. "Garrett, I did not take that necklace." "I'm not saying you meant to cause a problem." His tone was the particular tone of someone managing a situation they find unfortunate. "But Vivian is upset, and this is getting out of hand, and the right thing to do right now is to apologize so we can all move forward." The right thing to do. I felt something inside me go very still. "I am not going to apologize," I said, "for something I did not do." Garrett exhaled a short, controlled breath through his nose that he had perfected over years of courtroom practice. He straightened slightly, and then he said the thing he had been holding. "Apologize to my wife for your disgusting behavior, and then get out of this house." His voice did not rise. It did not need to. "You are nothing compared to Vivian. She is refined. She is everything this family should be. You are an embarrassment to the Holbrook name." The room contracted. I felt it physically a tightening, as though the walls had moved several inches inward simultaneously. Someone near the back of the room made a small sound quickly suppressed. A child somewhere behind me asked a question in a small voice and was hushed immediately by an adult hand. My ears were ringing. Not from volume, from the specific frequency of hearing your own child say words like that to your face in your own home in front of the people you have known your entire life. Garrett walked to the front door. He took hold of that brass handle, the one his father had spent 3 hours installing, the one that was supposed to feel solid, the one that was the first thing people touched when they entered this home, and he opened it. The cold air came in immediately, a hard, immediate wall of it, 19 degrees, and carrying a fine, sharp edge of wind that made the candle flames on the mantel lean sideways. He stood there holding it open and looked at the wall to his left, not at me, at the wall. The message was very clear. I looked around the room one final time. Rosalind had risen to her feet, her face white and rigid, her hands clenched at her sides, and I could see from the set of her jaw that she was approximately 2 seconds from saying something that would have been both entirely justified and entirely unhelpful. I found her eyes and shook my head. One small, deliberate movement. She understood. Her jaw tightened further, but she did not speak. Donna Faye had not moved. She sat in her chair near the window with her coffee cup in her lap, her eyes on the floor, and her stillness was so complete that she might have been holding her breath. She did not look up. She did not look at me once. Charlene Mobley, seated near the center of the room, had gone very pale. Her phone was still in her lap. Her eyes were moving between me and Garrett and back with the rapid, helpless attention of someone watching a car accident from the sidewalk, unable to look away and unable to stop anything. I walked to the coat rack beside the door. I took down my coat, the red wool one I had bought in October, the one I had worn to 3 separate contractor walkthroughs because it was warm and had deep pockets, and I put it on. I buttoned each button. All 4 of them in order from the bottom up because my hands needed something methodical to do, and because I was not going to rush through a single motion of this departure and give anyone in this room the satisfaction of watching me flee. I did not look at Garrett as I passed him. I could smell his cologne, something clean and expensive that Vivian had chosen for him, I assumed because it was nothing like the aftershave he had worn for the first 25 years of his life. I was close enough to him to reach out and touch his arm. I did not. I stepped through the door and onto the porch. The cold hit me like something solid. I walked down the front steps and onto the brick path, my shoes pressing into the thin layer of new snow that had fallen since the afternoon, my breath coming out in short white bursts that dissolved immediately into the dark air. Behind me, I heard the door close, solid heavy the way a well-hung door closes when someone lets it go with intention rather than force. And then the deadbolt. That sound. That particular small mechanical click of a bolt sliding home in a lock, the sound of a door being sealed from the inside against the person standing outside. In 35 years, I had never heard that sound from this side of the door. I had always been the one on the inside. I had always been the one doing the locking, the securing, the making safe. I stood on the brick path in 19-degree air and listened to the silence after it. My chest hurt, not metaphorically, physically, an actual constriction behind my sternum that I recognized as the body's response to shock, to the sudden, irreversible understanding that something has changed and will not change back. My eyes were burning, and my jaw was clenched so tight that my back teeth ached, and I could feel somewhere beneath all of it a grief so large and so old that it had clearly been waiting a long time to be acknowledged. I did not cry, not yet. I put one foot in front of the other and walked toward the end of the driveway, and I did not look back at the lit windows of the house where my son was standing on the other side of a door he had just locked against me. Not once. There were footprints in the snow along the front path. Mine. From that night. The temperature had dropped further in the days since Christmas Eve, and the snow had not melted, had instead hardened into a kind of pale granular crust that preserved impressions, the way cold preserves everything slowing decay, holding shape long past the moment that made it. I could see where I had walked the uneven spacing of someone moving carefully on slippery ground, the deeper impressions at the toe where I had pushed off rather than lifted, the way the tracks turned at the end of the driveway and did not turn back. I had stood at the window looking at those footprints for 3 days before I could bring myself to come back to this house. I leaned against the porch railing now and looked at them, and I let myself remember what it had felt like to make them. The cold had been a physical presence, not the ordinary cold of a Connecticut December evening, the kind you walk through briefly between a warm car and a warm building, and barely register. This was the cold of standing still in it, of being in it, without destination or shelter, of having nowhere particular to go, and no particular urgency to get there, because the place you had always gone, the place that had always been yours, had just locked its door against you. It was 19 degrees. I know because I checked my phone when I reached the end of the driveway, not to call anyone yet, but because I needed to do something. With my hands needed to look at something small and factual and indifferent to what had just happened to me. 19 degrees, 8:47 in the evening. Edward had placed a stone bench at the end of the front walk in the summer of 2005. A simple thing, blue stone, wide enough for 2 people set slightly back from the property line under the old oak tree that had been there since before we bought the house. He'd said it was for reading in the morning when the weather was good. I had never once used it for that. I had thought of it honestly as one of Edward's small, optimistic gestures toward a version of domestic life that was slightly more leisurely than the one we actually lived. A bench nobody sat on. A lovely idea. I sat on it that night. The cold of the stone came through my coat. Immediately, a deep, penetrating chill that settled into the backs of my thighs and did not leave. I put my hands in my pockets. I looked up at the lit windows of my house, the warm, amber glow of the living room, the sharper white of the kitchen, the soft blue flicker of a television somewhere on the second floor, and I breathed. In, out, in, out. My chest hurt in a way I could not precisely locate. It was not one pain, but several layered over each other like strata. The fresh, sharp one of what had just happened, the older, duller one of the years of small diminishments that had preceded it, and underneath both of those something deeper and wider that had no clean edges, that had been there since March of 2019 and had never fully resolved itself. That was the grief of doing all of this alone when I had not expected to be alone. I pulled out my phone. My fingers were already stiffening in the cold, the joints protesting the fine motor work of typing. I opened my messages and found Rosalind's name at the top of the list, where it always was, where it had been for 15 years of being the person I talked to most. I typed, "Come get me. Olmsted Lane. Don't call. Just come." I sent it and put the phone back in my pocket and looked at the oak tree above me, its bare branches holding small accumulations of snow at each fork and junction, a delicate filigree of white against the dark sky. It was, I remember thinking, genuinely beautiful. The kind of thing you see and register as beautiful, even when everything else is terrible, because beauty does not consult your circumstances before presenting itself. I counted the minutes. 1, 2, 3. I counted them the way I used to count contractions in the hospital 32 years ago, with that same narrow, focused attention that holds the rest of the mind together by giving it something precise and manageable to do. 4, 5. I was not going to fall apart on this bench. I was not going to walk back to that door. I was not going to call anyone, not yet. Not until Rosalind came, because Rosalind was who I needed, and I had said what I needed to say to her in 8 words, and she would understand them, because she always understood. 11 minutes, 12. My phone buzzed once in my pocket. A single vibration, no sound. I had turned the ringer off before dinner, a habit from years of working in an office where calls came at inconvenient times. I did not take it out. I already knew it was not Rosalind. She would not text back. She would simply drive, because that is the kind of person she is. 17 minutes after I sat down on that bench, headlights appeared at the far end of Olmsted Lane. Rosalind drove a dark blue Subaru that she had owned for 6 years and maintained with a conscientiousness that bordered on devotion. I recognized the headlights before she even turned into the driveway, the particular spacing of them, the height, the way they swept across the oak tree as she turned. She pulled up to the curb rather than into the driveway and was out of the car before the engine had finished settling into silence. She crossed the snow-covered lawn at something close to a run. She was not dressed for the cold. She had come straight from inside, no coat, over her red sweater, just her car keys in one hand. She reached me, and I stood up from the bench, and she put both arms around me without a word, without a question, without any of the reasonable preamble that a less perceptive person might have offered. She simply held on her arms tight across my back, her chin against my temple, the warmth of her coming through both our layers of clothing like something I had not known I was starving for. And then I cried. Not the restrained, private kind of crying I had been suppressing for hours, the other kind, the kind that comes from somewhere below the level of decision that bypasses whatever composure you have constructed and arrives without asking permission. My shoulders shook. My breath came in those awful hitching increments that are not quite sobs but are the precursors to them. I pressed my face against Rosalind's shoulder and felt her arms tighten further, and I cried for my son, for my house, for the 17 minutes on a cold bench that Edward had placed there 15 years ago, for a quiet morning that never came, and for the fact that none of this should have happened, but it had. Rosalind did not say it was going to be okay. She was too honest for that. She said into the top of my head, "I've got you. Come on, let's get you warm." She walked me to the passenger side of her car, her arm around my shoulders, her keys already in the lock. She put me inside. She turned the heat on full before she had even put the car in drive. And then she pulled away from the curb on Olmsted Lane, and I watched my house grow smaller in the side mirror, still lit, still warm-looking from the outside, still every bit the home I had made it, and I turned my face forward and did not look back again. The drive to Bethel took 12 minutes. We did not speak. We did not need to. The heater ran and the road was dark, and the snow on either side of the highway caught the headlights and glowed briefly and went dark again. And somewhere in those 12 minutes, I stopped shaking. I was still a long way from okay, but I had stopped shaking, and that for the moment was enough. The guest bedroom at Rosalind's house on Plumtrees Road was small in the way that only truly welcoming rooms can be, narrow, warm-smelling of cedar, and old cotton quilts that had been washed too many times to hold any particular scent but comfort itself. A single lamp on the nightstand threw amber light across the ceiling, and outside the window the snow had slowed to a drift of occasional flakes catching the light from the porch below. It was just after 9:30 on Christmas Eve, and I was sitting on the edge of the guest bed with a mug of chamomile tea that Rosalind had pressed into my hands without asking whether I wanted it. I hadn't touched it yet. The ceramic was warm against my palms, and that was enough. "You need to eat something," Rosalind said from the doorway. She was still in her coat, hadn't bothered to take it off, as though she expected we might need to leave again at any moment. Rosalind had always been like that, prepared for the next emergency, before the current one had finished. "I'm not hungry," I said. That's not what I asked. She disappeared down the hall and came back 2 minutes later with a plate of crackers and cheddar cheese, the kind she kept in bulk from the B.J.'s Wholesale in Danbury. She set it on the nightstand next to the lamp and sat in the wooden chair across from me, the one she normally kept piled with folded laundry. "Tell me what happened," she said, "from the beginning. Not the part I saw, the part before." I looked at her. Rosalind Faye Mercer was 57 years old and had the particular kind of face that didn't soften with sympathy so much as sharpen with attention. She had been the one to call the ambulance when Edward collapsed in 2019. She had been the one to drive me to the attorney's office after the funeral when I couldn't remember how traffic lights worked. She was not a woman who offered comfort in soft words. She offered presence, and that was worth more. So I told her. I told her about the renovation, the $163,000 the contractor who had finished the last coat of paint on the study walls in early November. I told her about Garrett's calls that had grown shorter and more clipped through the fall about Vivian's comments over the summer. The ones about the neighborhood, the house value, the cost of upkeep for a woman living alone. I told her about the way Garrett had looked at the freshly painted walls that afternoon, not with the pleasure of a son returning home, but with the calculation of a man taking inventory. Rosalind listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, not the silence of someone with nothing to say, but the silence of someone organizing what they needed to say into the right order. "There's something you don't know," she finally said. I set down the mug. "What do you mean?" "About 3 weeks ago, maybe a little more, Donna Faye called me." Rosalind folded her hands in her lap, her knuckles pressing white. "She said Garrett had come to see her, not to visit, to ask a favor." My chest went tight. Donna Faye Lester was my first cousin on my mother's side, a quiet woman from Shelton who had worked 20 years in records administration before retiring. We were not close, hadn't been since our 20s, but she showed up to family gatherings out of some obligation to the idea of family that I had always respected, if not fully understood. "What kind of favor?" I asked. She didn't say exactly. Rosalind's jaw tightened. She said she hadn't agreed to it, that she'd told him no. But the way she described it, Nadine, she said he was looking for someone who knew how to handle documents, someone who understood how county records worked. The word landed in the room like a stone dropping into still water. "Documents? Why didn't you tell me?" My voice came out steadier than I felt. My hands wrapped around the mug had gone cold despite the heat of the ceramic. "Because Donna said she'd told him no," Rosalind said, "and because I didn't want to worry you over something that might have been nothing. I thought—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I thought I was protecting you." "Did she say anything else? Anything about what kind of documents?" Rosalind looked at me directly. She mentioned a name, someone Garrett had been dealing with, a man named Thomas Briggs out of Bridgeport. She said Donna recognized the name from a fraud case that had come through her office years ago, which is why she'd refused to get involved. Thomas Briggs. I had never heard the name. But the fact that Donna Faye, methodical, careful paper trail. Donna Faye had recognized it from a fraud case was enough to make the room feel several degrees colder than it actually was. "I need to call Harold," I said. Harold Beckett had been my attorney for 11 years, the same man who had helped me set up Edward's estate after the funeral, who had reviewed the mortgage documentation when Garrett had first started asking questions about the property last spring. He was 62 years old, practiced out of an office on Katuna Street in Ridgefield, and he had a particular tone of voice he used when something required immediate attention. I had heard it once before in 2020, and I had not forgotten what it sounded like. "It's Christmas Eve," Rosalind said. "I know what day it is." She didn't argue. She handed me her phone charger from the nightstand drawer, and I plugged in my own phone. The battery had dropped to 11% somewhere between the front porch of Olmsted Lane and this room, and I pulled up Harold's number. I didn't call him yet. It was 9:47. I would call at 7 in the morning when I could think clearly enough to say the right things in the right order. But I saved his number to the top of my contacts and set the phone face up on the nightstand where I could see it. Outside, the snow had stopped entirely. The porch light threw a clean yellow circle across the front walk of Rosalind's yard, and the street beyond was completely still. I ate 3 crackers without tasting them, finished the chamomile tea, and lay back on the guest bed with my coat still on. I did not sleep. But for the first time since the front door had closed behind me, I felt something shift not toward relief, but toward clarity. There was a name now. Thomas Briggs. And Donna Fay knew it. That was the first thread. And threads, as Edward used to say, only exist because something is unraveling. The first light of Christmas morning came in through the guest bedroom window as a pale gray, wash the kind of light that doesn't so much illuminate a room as suggest it outlining the chair, the nightstand, the curtain, hem against the floor, all in shades of ash and pewter. I had not slept. I had lain on top of the quilt with my coat draped over me like a blanket, watching the ceiling change color as the hours passed, and now it was 6:53 in the morning, and the house on Plumtrees Road was completely still. I heard Rosalind's door open at 7:04. She walked down the hall to the kitchen without knocking on my door first. She had always understood that being left alone and being abandoned were two different things, and that the distance between them was measured in small courtesies, like letting a person get up on their own. I heard the coffee maker begin its cycle, the low mechanical hiss of it, and I sat up. My coat had slid to the floor during the night. I picked it up, folded it over the back of the wooden chair, and stood at the window for a moment, looking out at Rosalind's front yard. The snow from last night had settled into a clean, unbroken layer across the lawn and the front walk, covering everything in a silence so complete it felt almost deliberate, as though the world had decided just for this morning to hold still. I went to the kitchen. Rosalind handed me a cup of coffee without speaking, which was its own kind of language, and I sat at her small table near the window that looked out onto the backyard fence. A bird feeder hung from the maple tree at the corner of the yard, and two dark-eyed juncos were working through the seed with the focused efficiency of creatures that had no interest in the complications of the household they were visiting. At 7:19, Rosalind's phone rang. She looked at the screen and something in her expression shifted. Not alarm exactly, but attention sharpening to a fine point. "It's Charlene," she said. "Charlene Mobley." I had not thought about her since the dinner table, since the way she had held her phone at an odd angle near the centerpiece, which I had assumed at the time was one of her habits. Charlene had retired from teaching middle school English in Ridgefield 3 years earlier, and had since developed what the family charitably described as an enthusiasm for documenting things. Birthdays, graduations, Sunday lunches. She photographed and filmed with the dedication of someone who believed that if an event was not recorded, it had not fully occurred. Rosalind answered on the second ring. I watched her face. "Yes," Rosalind said. "Then, when?" Then, after a pause that lasted long enough for the juncos outside to finish and leave the feeder entirely. "Send it to me right now. Don't show anyone else, not yet." She ended the call and set the phone on the table between us. "Charlene filmed the whole dinner," Rosalind said. "She said she started recording when Vivian began talking about the necklace. She said something felt off and she wanted her words. She wanted a record." My hands were still around the coffee cup. "What did she get?" Rosalind didn't answer immediately. Her phone buzzed once, twice the soft, successive vibration of a file being received. She opened it, and for a moment she watched whatever was on the screen with an expression I had never seen on her face before. It was the expression of someone watching something they had suspected but had not wanted to confirm. She turned the phone to face me. The video was 47 seconds long. The angle was from Charlene's seat at the far end of the table, slightly elevated looking down toward the fireplace end of the room where Vivian had been standing when she first raised her voice about the necklace. The audio was imperfect, the overlap of voices, the clink of dishes being gathered, but the image was clear enough. Vivian Stark, in her dark green dress, standing near the sideboard where the dessert plates had been stacked. Her right hand moved toward the surface of the sideboard with the smooth economy of someone who had rehearsed the motion, and in the brief moment before she turned back to face the room, her fingers closed around something. Something that caught the light in the way that only faceted stones do, and her hand went directly into the deep front pocket of her dress. She turned back. Her expression was composed. She was already talking, her voice rising the words stolen, audible even through the noise of the room. I watched it twice. The second time, I paused it at the 3-second mark just before her hand moved, and I could see the necklace on the edge of the sideboard where I had set it down earlier when I'd gone to help carry plates. I had set it there because the clasp had been bothering my neck, and I had intended to pick it up again after the table was cleared. I had not stolen anything. I had set a piece of jewelry on a sideboard in my own home, and Vivian Stark had put it in her pocket and then accused me of theft in front of 20 people. The coffee in my cup had gone cold. I did not notice. Harold, I said. My voice was very level. I need to call Harold right now. It's Christmas morning, Rosalind said, but she said it the way people say things they already know won't matter. I know, I said, and I picked up my phone. It rang 4 times before Harold Beckett answered. He sounded alert in the way that people who have practiced law for 35 years tend to sound even when woken early, not surprised, exactly just momentarily recalibrating. I told him I had video evidence of the necklace incident and that there was a name Thomas Briggs connected to Garrett, connected to county documents and real property records. I gave him the information in the order it had come to me cleanly and without editorializing. Harold was quiet for 6 seconds. Then he said, "Forward the video to my email. Don't share it with anyone else. And Nadine, don't go back to the house today." I said I understood. "One more thing," he said before hanging up. "Check your messages. Sometimes people say things in writing that they would never say out loud." I ended the call and opened my texts. There was one message I had not seen sent at 11:31 the previous night from a number I recognized as Vivian's. It read, "He was going to do this to you eventually. I just gave him a reason to do it sooner." I read it 3 times. Then I set the phone on the table screen up and looked out at the backyard where the bird feeder hung empty and still in the cold white light of Christmas morning. There was no satisfaction in that message. No apology, only a calculation dressed up as a confession and that in its own way told me everything I needed to know about what kind of enemy I was dealing with. Before I show you what Charlene's phone captured that Christmas morning, drop a number in the comments. Just 9, so I know you are still with me. Because what you are about to see changes everything that came before it. Heads up, this story contains fictional elements crafted for storytelling and educational purposes. It may not reflect events exactly as they occurred, and if that is not your preference, this is a perfectly fine place to stop. Harold Beckett's home office on the 2nd floor of his house on Katuna Street was not the kind of space that suggested leisure. There were no holiday decorations, no concession to the fact that it was Christmas morning, only 2 long bookshelves lined with Connecticut statutory guides and case binders, a mahogany desk with a green glass lamp already burning, and a whiteboard on the far wall that he used to map document chains when a case required it. The street outside was quiet the way Ridgefield went quiet on holidays, and the snow muffled even the occasional passing car into something barely audible. I had arrived at 9:15. Rosalind had driven me, waited in the car without being asked. Harold had met me at the front door in a cardigan and reading glasses, the kind of man who dressed for work even when work came to him on Christmas Day, and he had led me upstairs without ceremony or small talk, which was exactly what I needed. "Sit," he said, and gestured to the chair across from his desk. I sat. He'd already pulled up his email on the desktop monitor. The video Charlene had sent forwarded from Rosalind's phone to mine, and then to his was open in a separate window. He had watched it before I arrived. I could tell by the way he was looking at the screen, not with the attention of someone seeing something for the first time, but with the focused stillness of someone who had already formed a preliminary conclusion and was now testing it against what he knew. "The video is clear enough," he said. "That takes care of the theft accusation?" He folded his hands on the desk. "Now tell me again about Thomas Briggs, everything Rosalind relayed to you. Don't paraphrase, give me the words as closely as you remember them." I did. I told him what Rosalind had said about Donna Faye's call 3 weeks earlier, the favor Garrett had asked for, the reference to someone who understood how county records worked, and the name that Donna Faye had recognized from a fraud case that had passed through her records office years before. Harold listened without writing anything down, which meant he was filing it in a way that required no notes. When I finished, he turned to the second monitor on his desk, a smaller screen to his left, and typed for approximately 90 seconds. Then he stopped and looked at what was on the screen, with an expression that I had only seen once before in 2020, when he had reviewed the language of a property assessment clause that a developer had tried to slip past me during a routine maintenance negotiation. It was the expression of a man who had found exactly what he was looking for and wished for my sake that he hadn't. He, Thomas Briggs, Harold said, had a Connecticut notary commission that was revoked in 2018 following a complaint filed with the Secretary of State's office. The complaint alleged that he had notarized documents without the signatory present, which is a direct violation of Connecticut General Statutes, Section 3-94B. He paused. He was also named in a civil suit in Bridgeport Superior Court in 2019 related to a fraudulent title transfer. The case was settled out of court. He is not a licensed notary, has not been for 6 years. The room was very quiet, which means, I said slowly, that any document bearing his seal is legally void, Harold said. The notarization is fraudulent. The seal itself is counterfeit, which means that whatever authorization Garrett may have prepared using Briggs's services carries no legal weight under Connecticut law, and more significantly, it constitutes second-degree forgery under Connecticut General Statutes, Section 53A, 139, which is a Class D felony. He let that sit for a moment before continuing. There's something else. He turned back to the main monitor and opened a document I could not fully read from where I sat, a scanned form, the header, bearing the seal of the Connecticut Statewide Grievance Committee. In March of 2020, a complaint was filed with the Office of Chief Disciplinary Counsel against Garrett Owen Holbrook, then practicing as an associate at a firm in Westport. The complaint alleged that he had improperly influenced a financial instrument belonging to an elderly client, a power of attorney reassignment that benefited a third party connected to Garrett personally. Harold looked up at me over his reading glasses. The complaint was reviewed and ultimately closed without formal action. The client declined to pursue it. But the record exists, Nadine. It exists, and it is part of the Statewide Grievance Committee's permanent file. My hands were flat on my knees. I noticed this because I had pressed them there deliberately at some point in the last 2 minutes without being conscious of doing so. He's done this before, I said. It was not a question. The pattern is consistent, Harold said carefully. I'm not in a position to draw legal conclusions from a closed grievance file, but I can tell you that the combination of a fraudulent notarization, a revoked notary, and a prior complaint involving financial manipulation of an elderly person's property authorization is not coincidental. He pulled a yellow legal pad from the top drawer of his desk and uncapped a pen, the kind of pen that meant the conversation had moved from preliminary to formal. I need you to give me written authorization to request the Ridgefield Town Clerk's property records for Olmsted Lane, he said, specifically the deed history and any recorded instruments filed in the last 6 months. If Garrett used Briggs to forge a power of attorney, there may already be a filing in the land records. He slid the pad across the desk, and I need you to understand that once I pull those records, whatever we find becomes the basis of a formal legal action. There is no pulling back from that. I looked at the legal pad. Then I looked at Harold. Then I picked up the pen. My hand was steady. I had not expected it to be, but it was. Pull the records, I said. I signed my name at the bottom of the authorization form in the same handwriting I had used for 60 years, the same looping G in Grace, the same deliberate H in Holbrook that Edward had once said looked like it meant business. And it did. It always had. Outside on Katuna Street, a single car moved slowly through the snow, its tires pressing the first tracks of the morning into the white surface of the road. By the time Harold walked me back downstairs 20 minutes later, he had already sent the records request by secure email to the town clerk's emergency line and had placed a call to a colleague at the Connecticut State Police Financial Crimes Unit. The threads, as it turned out, were not just unraveling. They had been unraveling for months. We were simply the first ones to start pulling. The Webster Bank branch on Danbury Road in Ridgefield was closed on Christmas Day. I had known it would be. Harold had told me as much when he walked me to the door on Katuna Street, and he had also told me that closing a joint account or restricting access to shared financial instruments did not require a branch visit. It required a phone call to the fraud prevention line, a verified identity, and a clear statement of intent. He had written the number on a card in his precise small handwriting and pressed it into my hand before I left. Rosalind was still in the car. She had the engine running for warmth, and when I opened the passenger door and got in, she looked at me the way she always looked at me when she was trying to determine how much of the truth I could carry without buckling. I had always found this slightly irritating. This time, I was grateful for it. "How bad?" she asked. "Bad enough that Harold is already making calls," I said. "Drive me back to your house. I need to use your landline." She pulled out of the Katuna Street cul-de-sac without asking why I needed the landline instead of my own cell phone. The reason was simple. Harold had advised me to keep my mobile line clear in case he needed to reach me quickly and to conduct any banking calls from a number that was not associated with either Garrett or Vivian's contact records. Rosalind's landline in Bethel was in her name alone. That was enough. We were back on Plumtrees Road by 10:40. I sat at Rosalind's kitchen table with the card Harold had given me and her cordless phone, and I dialed the Webster Bank fraud prevention line. The automated system transferred me to a live representative after 4 minutes, a man named Curtis, who spoke with the careful neutrality of someone trained to handle distressed callers without adding to the distress. I told him I needed to restrict all outgoing transactions on a joint account pending a legal review. I gave him the account number, my social security number, and the security phrase Edward and I had established when we opened the account in 2009, a cardinal. We had chosen the word cardinal because there had been one on the window ledge of the bank lobby the morning we signed the paperwork, and Edward had said it was a good omen. Curtis placed me on a brief hold. When he came back, his voice had shifted slightly, still neutral, but with an additional quality of attention that told me the system had flagged something. "Mrs. Holbrook," he said, "I can see that there was an attempted online access to this account at 11:58 p.m. last night from an unrecognized device. The attempt did not clear the two-factor authentication, so no transaction was completed. But I'd recommend we place a full restriction on the account immediately pending your review with our fraud department." My jaw tightened. 11:58 p.m. on December 24th, 27 minutes after Vivian had sent me that text message. "Place the full restriction," I said. "Done," Curtis said. "I'm also flagging the account for priority review by our fraud team on the next business day, which will be December 26th. You'll receive a call between 8 and 10 a.m. Is this number," he read back Rosalind's landline, "the best number to reach you?" I said it was. When I set the phone down, Rosalind was standing at the counter with a second cup of coffee she had poured, without asking which she set in front of me, with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that some situations required fuel more than conversation. "He tried to access the account last night," I said, "after midnight." Rosalind set her own cup down with a sound that was not quite a slam. "While you were standing in the snow," apparently. She said something under her breath that I will not repeat here, but that accurately characterized Garrett's moral character in 7 words. At 11:15, Harold called the landline. He had received a preliminary response from the Ridgefield Town Clerk's emergency records contact, a courtesy callback, not the full file, but enough to confirm that an instrument had been recorded against the Olmsted Lane property on November 14th of this year. The instrument was listed as a power of attorney authorization for property management. The notarizing signature on the filing was Thomas Briggs. "It's in the land records," Harold said, "which means it's a matter of public record, and it means Garrett had legal cover, fraudulent cover, but cover to act on your behalf regarding the property. We need Detective Sander involved as of today." Detective Roy Sander was with the Ridgefield Police Department's Financial Crimes and Property Fraud Unit, a division that Harold had apparently dealt with before, because he referred to Sander by first name with the familiarity of a professional acquaintance rather than a stranger. Harold had already left a message with the department's on-call line. Given that the complaint involved real property fraud and a forged public record, it qualified for a holiday callback. Xander called the landline at 1:47 in the afternoon. His voice was unhurried, the particular cadence of someone who had spent years in investigative work and had long since stopped being surprised by the things people did to each other over property and money. He asked me 4 questions. He did not ask me how I felt, or whether I was all right, or any of the questions that the situation might have seemed to invite. He asked for the address of the property, the full name of the individual who had filed the instrument, the name of the notary on record, and the date of filing. I gave him all 4 without hesitation. "November 14th, he repeated, and I heard the scratch of a pen. "And the notary is Thomas Briggs out of Bridgeport." "That's correct." A pause, short but weighted. "I know that name," he said, not with surprise, with the flat recognition of someone confirming a pattern they had seen before. Harold Beckett mentioned a civil case in 2019. "I offered." "Among other things," Sander said. "Mrs. Holbrook, I'm going to need you to come into the department on December 26th at 9 a.m. with your attorney. Bring everything, the video, the text message, any correspondence, the account restriction notice from Webster Bank, everything you have." "I'll be there," I said. After I hung up, I sat for a long moment looking at the card Harold had given me, the fraud prevention number on one side and on the back, in the same small handwriting, a single line he must have added before handing it to me. It read, "Document everything, date and time, every call." I turned the card over. I picked up Rosalind's pen from the notepad by the phone, and at the top of the first page I wrote, December 25th, 2024. Webster bank account restricted 10:47 a.m. Detective Roy Sander interview confirmed December 26th, 9 a.m. It was the first page of what would eventually become a 43-page record. Before I tell you what Detective Sander laid out on that conference table on December 26th, comment "Justice" if you are still watching, because what Harold and I walked into that morning was bigger than either of us had prepared for. Quick note, this story weaves in fictional elements for educational and storytelling purposes. Similarities to any names or places are coincidental, but everything this story teaches you is worth staying for. The Ridgefield Police Department on East Ridge Road sat back from the street behind a parking lot that had been plowed sometime before dawn, the snow pushed into low gray ridges along the edges of the pavement. It was 8:52 in the morning on December 26th, and the temperature had climbed 4 degrees overnight from 19 to 23 Fahrenheit, which felt in the way that marginal improvements sometimes do, like a gesture rather than a change. Harold was already in the parking lot when Rosalind pulled in. He was standing beside his car in a dark overcoat, with a leather briefcase at his feet, drinking coffee from a travel mug, and he raised one hand in greeting when he saw us, the economical wave of a man conserving energy for what was ahead. I had brought the 43-page notebook, the phone with Charlene's video, and Vivian's text message, and a manila envelope Harold had instructed me to prepare the night before, containing a written timeline of events from November 14th through December 25th. Organized by date and time. We went inside at 9 exactly. Detective Roy Sander was waiting in a conference room on the second floor, a room with a rectangular table, 4 chairs, a whiteboard with nothing written on it yet, and a window that looked out onto the bare crown of an oak tree. He stood when we entered. He was a compact man in his mid-40s, with close-cropped gray at his temples and the kind of posture that suggested he had spent years sitting across tables from people who were lying to him and had developed an almost physical sensitivity to the difference between a rehearsed account and a true one. He shook Harold's hand first, then mine, and gestured to the chairs. "Thank you for coming in," he said. "I know this isn't how anyone wants to spend the day after Christmas." No, and I agreed. It isn't. He had a legal pad in front of him and a pen he did not uncap until Harold had finished laying out the materials on the table between us, the phone, the manila envelope, the notebook. Sander looked at each item in turn, without touching any of them the way an examiner reviews a set before deciding where to begin. "Let's start with the video," he said. Harold connected my phone to a small display monitor on the conference room credenza, using a cable Sander produced from a desk drawer. The 47-second clip played once on the larger screen, and Sander watched it without expression, his pen still uncapped but held loosely. When it finished, he asked Harold to play it again. The second time, he paused it at the 3-second mark, the same frame I had paused on at Rosalind's kitchen table the morning before, and leaned forward slightly. "The lighting is sufficient," he said, more to himself than to us. "And the continuity is unbroken. No edit points in the metadata. None," Harold said. "I had a digital forensics contact verify the file integrity last night. I can provide the written confirmation." Sander nodded once and uncapped his pen. He wrote something on the legal pad that I could not read from my angle, and then he turned to the manila envelope. Harold slid it across the table. Sander removed the contents. My written timeline. The Webster Bank restriction. Notice a printed copy of the text message from Vivian, and read through each page with the thoroughness of someone who understood that the details other people considered minor were frequently the ones that mattered most. When he reached the text message, he read it twice. Then he set it down and looked at me directly for the first time since we had sat down. "She sent this at 11:31 p.m. on December 24th, he said. "Your account access attempt was flagged at 11:58, 27 minutes apart." "Yes," I said. "Did Vivian Stark have independent access to the joint account, or only through Garrett?" "Through Garrett," I said. Her name was never on the account, but Garrett had given her the login credentials. At some point, I didn't know that until Curtis at Webster Bank mentioned the unrecognized device. Sander made another note. Then he opened a folder he had brought to the table, thin gray with a case number already printed on the tab, and removed a single sheet of paper that he turned to face Harold and me. It was a printout from the Ridgefield Land Records database, the Olmsted Lane property, filed November 14th, 2024. The instrument type read Durable Power of Attorney Real Property Management Authorization. The grantor line read Nadine Grace Holbrook. The notary line read Thomas R. Briggs Notary Public Commission number CT-2014-8847. Commission number CT-2014-8847. Sander said was surrendered to the Connecticut Secretary of State's office on March 3, 2018, following a disciplinary proceeding. Thomas Briggs has had no valid notary commission in the state of Connecticut for 6 years. The seal on this document is a reproduction of a commission that no longer legally exists. He paused. Using a counterfeit notary seal to authenticate a real property instrument in Connecticut constitutes filing a fraudulent land record under Connecticut General Statutes Section 47-36AA, in addition to the second-degree forgery charge your attorney has already identified. Both carry felony classifications. Harold leaned forward slightly. What is the timeline for a property lien? I filed the application for a lis pendens this morning at 7:45 a.m. with Danbury Superior Court, Sander said. Given the documented fraud on a filed public record, the court clerk authorized an emergency processing. The lis pendens will be recorded against the Olmsted Lane property by 3:47 this afternoon. A lis pendens, from the Latin for pending suit, is a formal notice recorded in the land records indicating that a legal claim exists against a property. In practical terms, it means that no one can sell, transfer, refinance, or encumber the property without the court's knowledge and approval. It is in effect a legal lock on the front door. I had learned this from Harold during our phone call the evening before. Hearing Sander confirm it in this room at this table with the case number already on the folder tab made it real in a way that the phone call had not. So Garrett cannot move the property, I said. Not while the lis pendens is in effect, Sander said. And given the evidence you've provided this morning, I expect that to be in effect for some time. He closed the folder and looked at me with the same direct attention he had used throughout, not unkind, not warm, simply honest. Mrs. Holbrook, I want to be clear about what happens next. This is now a criminal investigation. That means the pace and the direction of the proceedings are no longer entirely in your hands or your attorney's. What I can tell you is that the evidence you've brought in today is substantial, and that the land record fraud alone is sufficient to open a formal case. He stood. Harold stood. I stood last, and when I picked up the 43-page notebook from the table, I noticed that my handwriting on the first page, the entry from yesterday morning, December 25, 2024, Webster bank account, restricted 10:47 a.m., looked very small against all the blank pages that followed it. By 3:47 that afternoon, while I was sitting at Rosalind's kitchen table eating a bowl of soup, I had not tasted my phone buzzed with a notification from the Connecticut Land Records alert system Harold had enrolled me in the night before. The lis pendens had been recorded. Olmsted Lane was mine again, not yet in the full legal sense, but in the sense that mattered right now. Nobody was going anywhere with it. The call came from Garrett at 6:19 in the evening on December 27th. I was sitting in Rosalind's living room with a cup of tea that had gone cold again. I had developed over the past 3 days a consistent inability to drink anything before it lost its heat. And when my phone lit up with his name, I looked at it for 4 full rings before I answered. Not because I was afraid of what he would say, because I wanted to be certain before I spoke a single word to him that I was ready. I answered on the 5th ring, "Mom." His voice was different from the voice that had told me to get out of my own house 3 nights ago. That voice had been controlled, deliberate, weighted with the particular confidence of someone executing a plan they believed was already finished. This voice was something else entirely thin at the edges, with a quality of barely contained pressure that I recognized from when he was 11 years old and had broken the kitchen window with a baseball and spent 3 hours working up to telling me. "Garrett," I said, "something happened." A pause. She's gone. She left." I said nothing. I let the silence sit. "Mom, I need you to listen to me. There was a safe in the bedroom closet. In the wall behind the shelf unit, I built it in when we moved into the guest suite in October when we were staying with you during the renovation. I kept cash in it. $74,000. His breath came unevenly. It's empty. She cleaned it out. And I found there was an envelope on the bed. A legal envelope. She filed for divorce, Mom. She filed on the 26th. Yesterday. While I was at the house waiting for the contractors to come back, I had known from the moment Harold described the account access attempt on Christmas Eve night that Vivian's involvement in this had never been the simple greed it appeared to be on the surface. Her text message had told me as much that coldly worded admission she had sent at 11:31 on Christmas Eve, which had never been an apology and was never meant to be. There was a coldness to that sentence that spoke of calculation running deeper and longer than a few months of financial scheming. Vivian Stark had been managing her own exit long before Christmas Eve. The dinner, the necklace, the expulsion, these had not been the plan. They had been the distraction. $74,000, I said. In cash, in a wall safe, in my house. A beat of silence. Mom. Garrett, that is my house. The guest suite you renovated in October was renovated with my money. The wall you built that shelf unit into is my wall. My voice was steady. I had not raised it. I did not need to. Where did $74,000 in cash come from? He did not answer that question. Instead, I need your help. I need you to, I don't know, I need you to tell Beckett to slow down whatever he's doing. Because if this goes any further with the police, You're going to what? I asked. Another silence, longer this time. I made a mistake, he said. The words came out compressed, as though he had practiced them until they lost their original shape. I made a serious mistake, and I know that. And I'm asking you as your son to give me a chance to fix it before this becomes something that can't be undone. I thought about the whiteboard in Detective Sanders' conference room, blank when we arrived, covered with a timeline by the time we left, Garrett's name appearing in 4 separate places on it. I thought about the card Harold had pressed into my hand on Christmas morning. I thought about the 43-page notebook and the entry at the top of the first page in my small, deliberate handwriting. Garrett. I said, I want you to understand something. I did not start this. I did not file a fraudulent document with the Ridgefield land records. I did not forge a notary seal. I did not try to access a joint bank account at midnight on Christmas Eve. I paused. And I did not put a wall safe in my own house without telling me. I know, he said. His voice had dropped to something just above a whisper. I know you didn't. Then you know there's nothing for me to slow down, I said. Because I am not the one who set it in motion. I ended the call. My hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the particular physical release that comes after, holding something tightly for a long time, and finally setting it down. I set the phone on the coffee table and looked at Rosalind, who had been sitting across from me the entire time with her hands folded and her eyes on my face, reading the conversation from my expression the way she had always been able to. She's gone, I said. Rosalind exhaled slowly. With the money. With $74,000, I said, cash from a safe he built into my wall in October. Rosalind looked at the ceiling for a moment with the expression of someone revising their assessment of a situation upward, not in admiration, but in the grim acknowledgement that the scope of what had been done to me was larger than either of us had fully understood 2 days ago. Does Harold know about the safe? She asked. He will in about 4 minutes, I said, and picked up my phone again. Harold answered on the second ring. I told him about the safe, the $74,000, the divorce filing, dated December 26th, and Vivian's disappearance. He listened without interrupting, which with Harold meant he was already 3 steps ahead, organizing what he had just heard into the framework of what he already knew. When I finished, he said, the divorce filing is actually useful to us. It establishes that Vivian acted independently of Garrett in at least one significant legal action. That distinction matters. A pause. The cash is more complicated. $74,000 in physical currency removed from a property under lease pendants may constitute dissipation of marital assets depending on the source. I'll need to review that angle. What about Vivian herself? I asked. Detective Sander will want to know about the divorce filing and the missing funds as of tomorrow morning, Harold said. I'll contact him tonight. He paused again, and I heard the sound of pages turning his legal pad. I imagined growing its own record of this case line by line. Nadine, whatever you're feeling right now, save it for later. Right now, I need you sharp. I'm sharp, I said. And I was. The shaking in my hands had stopped completely. Outside, the December night had closed in over Plumtree's Road, and the street was dark and still, and somewhere between Ridgefield and wherever she had decided to go, Vivian Stark was driving with $74,000 in a bag and a divorce petition already filed, and a text message she had sent at 11:31 on Christmas Eve that she had not, I suspected, intended to be quite so honest. She had told me what kind of enemy she was. She had simply not considered that I was paying attention. Garrett's car was in front of Rosalind's house when I came downstairs at 7:41 on the morning of December 28th. I had not slept. I saw the headlights go dark through the kitchen window and stood at the counter with my coffee and waited. Rosalind appeared in the doorway. "It's him." "I know," I said. "Let him in." He looked like a man who had not slept either, coat-wrinkled jaw, unshaven eyes, carrying the particular hollowness of someone who has spent the night arriving at a conclusion they had been avoiding for months. He sat down across from me at the kitchen table without being invited, and he set something between us before he spoke a single word. A home pregnancy test. Positive. A date written in black marker in the upper corner, December 18th, in handwriting that was not his. "I found it under the baseboard in the guest room," he said. "She was pregnant when she left. She never told me." I looked at the test. Then I looked at him. Where did $74,000 in cash come from Garrett? He pressed his hands flat on the table. Savings. Money I had moved into physical currency in September when the creditors started contacting Vivian's attorneys. I was trying to protect it. In a wall safe. In my house, without telling me. He didn't answer that. "Tell me about Vivian," I said. "The real version." What came out over the next 10 minutes was this: Vivian's family import firm had accumulated $890,000 in debt by mid-2022, which she had personally guaranteed without telling Garrett. By September of this year, the creditors were actively pursuing her assets. Her plan, she had designed every element of it, was to use a fraudulent power of attorney to establish management authority over Olmsted Lane, leverage the property's $1.2 million value as collateral to restructure the debt and repay it before I became aware. Garrett had known it was illegal. He had done it anyway because she had convinced him there was no other way and that it would never surface. "She used you," I said. "Yes." The word came out stripped bare. "And I let her." I thought about that text message, the one she had sent while I was still standing outside in the cold. She had known exactly what she was doing, and she had been managing her exit long before the dinner. The accusation, the necklace, the expulsion, none of it had been impulse. It had been a schedule. "There is a child somewhere in this," I said quietly. "Whatever else is true." Garrett stared at the pregnancy test on the table between us. His shoulders dropped by a fraction the same way they had when he was small, and something had finally reached him past the place where arguments could not. "I know," he said. The porch light outside clicked off as the morning grew bright enough to make it unnecessary. I stood and carried my cup to the sink. There was nothing more to say in this kitchen on this morning. But there was one thing left that only I could give him, and it was not yet time. The back steps of Rosalind's house faced a narrow yard that backed up against a stand of bare birch trees, their white trunks pale as paper against the gray December sky. It was just past 9 in the morning when Garrett followed me outside. I had needed air, and he had followed without asking permission, which was itself a kind of answer about where he thought things stood between us. He sat on the top step. I stood at the bottom, facing the birch trees, my coat buttoned to the collar. "I'm going to lose my license," he said. "The bar complaint from 2020, Sander pulled it. Harold told me last night. If this goes to trial, the statewide grievance committee reopens the file and I'm finished. 15 years of work, Mom. Everything I built." I turned to look at him. He was hunched forward with his elbows on his knees, not looking at me, but at the frozen ground between his feet. "You built it on something that was already cracked," I said. "The 2020 complaint didn't appear out of nowhere. I was trying to protect a client's assets from a bad divorce settlement." His voice rose slightly. "It wasn't the same as this." "The grievance committee disagreed enough to open a file," I said. "And so did I when Harold showed it to me." He looked up then. His eyes were red at the rims, whether from cold or sleeplessness, or something else I could not say. I need you to call Harold and ask him to pursue a civil settlement instead of criminal charges. If it stays civil, the bar complaint stays closed. I'll sign over whatever you need. Full restitution, legal fees, everything. I thought about November 14th, the date Thomas Briggs had pressed a counterfeit seal onto a document bearing my name. A document I had never seen and never signed, filed in the Ridgefield land records as though I did not exist as anything more than a name on a line. I thought about Christmas Eve standing on my own porch in 19-degree air while the lights of my own house burned behind a closed door. Garrett. I said, what you're describing is not my decision to make. Detective Sander opened a criminal investigation. The state of Connecticut is the complainant now, not me. I cannot call Harold and make this go away because it was never mine to give away. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. A sound came from him that was not quite a word and not quite anything else, the sound of a man arriving too late at the full weight of a thing he had set in motion. Then what do I do, he asked. You get an attorney, I said. A good one. Not Harold. Harold represents me. Your own attorney. You cooperate fully with Detective Sander. You tell them everything about Vivian, everything about Briggs, everything about the debt, all of it, without calculating what helps you and what doesn't. I paused. And you accept what comes from that. He was quiet for a long moment. The birch trees stood still in the windless cold. Are you done with me? He asked. His voice was very small. As my mother, are you done? I looked at my son, 32 years old, sitting on a back step in a wrinkled coat, having dismantled in 3 months what his father and I had spent 30 years building. And I thought about Edward, who had loved Garrett with the particular patience of a man who understood that loving someone and excusing them were two entirely different things. I'm not done with you, I said, but I am done protecting you from the consequences of what you chose to do. Those are not the same thing. I went back inside. He sat on the step for a long time after that. I watched him through the kitchen window without letting him see me watching, and eventually he stood, walked to his car, and drove away in the direction of Ridgefield. He had an attorney to find, and I had one more thing left to give him, but not yet, not today. The afternoon of December 28th passed slowly in the way that days do when the significant things have already happened, and what remains is the waiting. Harold called at 2:13. Sander completed his preliminary verification this morning, he said without preamble. The video file metadata has been formally authenticated by the State Forensic Lab's digital unit in Meriden. Charlene Mobley's recording is admissible as evidence. A brief pause. He also confirmed that Thomas Briggs was located at his Bridgeport address this morning and brought in for questioning. Briggs gave a voluntary statement. He confirmed that Garrett approached him in late October and paid him $3,000 in cash to produce a notarized power of attorney document using his old commission seal. $3,000. That was what the seal on my name had cost. What happens to Briggs? I asked. He's cooperating in exchange for consideration on the charges, Harold said, which means his testimony will be part of the criminal case against Garrett, combined with Garrett's own admission to you this morning, which I'd strongly encourage you to write down in full detail while it's fresh date and time it, and add it to the notebook the state's case is substantially built. I pulled the notebook toward me across the kitchen table and uncapped the pen. What about the lis pendens, the property? Still firmly in place. Nothing has moved on the title. And given Briggs's statement today, the fraudulent POA will be formally voided by the court as early as next week. You'll receive written confirmation when it's recorded. Harold's voice shifted slightly, not softer exactly, but more deliberate. Nadine, I want you to understand what this means practically. The house is yours. It has always been yours. What Garrett and Vivian attempted to do failed completely. The record will reflect that. I wrote the date and time at the top of a fresh page, December 28th, 2024, 2:13 p.m., and began documenting Harold's report word by word. At 4:45, Garrett called my cell phone. I answered. I found an attorney, he said. His voice was flat and controlled in the way that people sound when they have spent several hours making difficult phone calls and have run out of the energy required for anything beyond basic function. Stuart Grimes out of Danbury. He's agreed to represent me. Good, I said. A pause. He told me to stop contacting you directly, that all communication should go through counsel from this point forward. Another pause. So I think this is the last time I'll be able to call you like this for a while. I set the pen down. Outside the kitchen window, the December afternoon had already begun its early slide toward dark, the sky above the birch trees turning the deep blue-gray of late winter dusk. I understand, I said. Mom, his voice dropped. The thing you said this morning, that you're not done with me. He stopped, started again. I need to know if you meant that. I looked at the notebook in front of me, 43 pages of dates and times and names and dollar amounts and legal statutes, the entire architecture of what he had done to me laid out in my own handwriting. Then I thought about what was still in my coat pocket, the thing I had not yet given him, the thing that was not mine to withhold forever. I meant it, I said. But Garrett, let Stuart Grimes do his job and let Harold do his. Don't call me again until this is resolved. He said he understood. He said he was sorry. He said it the way people say things they mean but know are insufficient, and I received it the way you receive something that is true, but too late and too small for the space it needs to fill. After I ended the call, I sat for a long time at the kitchen table. The notebook was open in front of me, the pen uncapped, the afternoon light fading through the window. There was one task left that was mine alone to do, not Harold's, not Sanders', mine. I reached into my coat pocket and closed my fingers around the envelope I had been carrying since the morning I left Olmsted Lane. Edward's handwriting on the front, my name in his careful slanted letters. Tomorrow, I decided. I would give it to Garrett tomorrow. Harold had suggested neutral ground, and on the morning of December 29th, I walked into Turn Page on Governor Street in Ridgefield, a small coffee shop I had passed 100 times without ever going inside, which felt for that reason like exactly the right place for what I needed to say. It was 9:20 in the morning on December 29th. The shop was quiet, the post-Christmas lull settling over the town like the snow that had fallen and refrozen overnight. Garrett was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with both hands wrapped around a coffee cup he had not touched. I sat across from him and set the envelope on the table between us. It was a standard white letter envelope sealed with the kind of careful pressure that meant the person sealing it had taken their time. Edward's handwriting on the front, "For Garrett when the time comes," in the slanted, deliberate cursive he had used his entire adult life. The ink had faded slightly in the 4 years since his death, but the letters were clear. Garrett stared at it. His jaw tightened. When did he write this? 3 weeks before he died, I said. He gave it to Harold Beckett for safekeeping. Harold gave it to me at the estate review in February 2020. He told me Edward had said I would know when to pass it along. I paused. I know now. Garrett picked up the envelope with both hands, the way you handle something you are not certain you want to open. He broke the seal, carefully removed 3 pages of white paper, folded in thirds, and began to read. I did not read over his shoulder. I looked out the window at Governor Street, the bare trees, the gray morning sky, a single car moving slowly through the intersection at the end of the block. I gave him the privacy of the words his father had left him. He read for 4 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the wall above the counter without meaning to. When he set the pages down, his eyes were wet. He did not try to conceal this. Edward's letter, as Harold had summarized it to me in 2020, and as I had since read myself, was 3 things at once. It was a father's acknowledgement that he had seen clearly and without illusion who his son was becoming in his late 20s, the shortcuts, the rationalizations, the growing belief that intelligence was a substitute for integrity. It was a legal instrument in the form of a reference to the revocable, living trust that Edward had established in 2019, which placed the Olmsted Lane property and all associated assets under Nadine's sole control with protections that no power of attorney could override. And it was in its final paragraph, a love letter to Garrett, specific and unsentimental, the kind of love that does not soften the truth, but refuses to abandon the person inside it. I am not writing this because I think you are lost, Edward had written. I am writing this because I think you are someone who will need to find his way back from something difficult, and I want you to know the road exists. Garrett pressed the back of his hand against his eyes once quickly. Then he refolded the pages, replaced them in the envelope, and set it on the table. He knew, Garrett said. It was not a question. He loved you, I said. Those are not contradictory things. Garrett looked at me across the small table with the coffee between us, going cold in a coffee shop on a quiet December morning in the town where he had grown up, and for the first time in a very long time, perhaps the first time since before Edward died, I saw my son's face without the layer of calculation that had settled over it somewhere in the years between. He picked up the envelope and put it in his coat pocket. "I'll cooperate fully with Sander," he said. "Everything, no conditions." "I know," I said. I left first. Outside on Governor Street, the cold was clean and still, and the morning felt for the first time in 6 days like something that belonged to me again. The Olmsted Lane house looked different in April. Not structurally, the colonial facade was the same, the white trim Edward had repainted in the summer of 2017, the blue stone front walk he had laid by hand over 2 weekends in 2005. But light moves differently through bare trees than through snow-covered ones, and by April the birches at the edge of the property had begun pushing out the first pale green of new growth, and the whole yard had a quality of quiet momentum that winter had kept pressed down for months. I moved back on March 14th, 2025, 11 weeks after Christmas Eve. The legal proceedings had resolved faster than Harold had cautioned me to expect, for reasons he attributed to the overwhelming documentary evidence and Garrett's full cooperation with the state. In January, the Danbury Superior Court formally voided the fraudulent power of attorney and expunged it from the Ridgefield land records. The Revocable Living Trust Edward had established in 2019 was confirmed as the governing instrument for the Olmsted Lane property, placing it beyond the reach of any future claim by any party. Garrett entered a plea agreement in February. He received a suspended sentence, 3 years of probation, mandatory restitution of $218,000 to cover legal fees and documented damages, and a formal suspension of his Connecticut bar license pending a 2-year review period. Stuart Grimes had negotiated competently. The outcome was neither lenient nor crushing. It was proportionate, which is the best that law can usually manage. Thomas Briggs was charged with second-degree forgery and filing a fraudulent land record. He pled guilty in March and received 18 months of supervised probation and a permanent bar from notary services in Connecticut. Donna Faye Lester accepted a plea deal for her role in the scheme. Although she had declined to participate directly, investigators determined that she had knowingly introduced Garrett to Thomas Briggs and had said nothing to prevent what followed, which under Connecticut law was sufficient to establish civil liability for facilitation. She paid a $12,000 civil penalty and performed 200 hours of community service. She called me once, in late January, and said she was sorry. I told her I believed her. I also told her I needed time, and she said she understood. Vivian Stark was never located. The divorce was finalized in absentia in March. Wherever she had gone with the $74,000 and the pregnancy that she had kept to herself, the Connecticut courts could not reach her. Harold told me that the matter remained open and that it might remain open for years. I had made my peace with that. Some threads do not tie off cleanly, and the loose end of Vivian's story was not mine to resolve. On the morning I moved back, Rosalind helped me carry boxes through the front door, the same door whose brass handle I had touched 10,000 times over 35 years. And when the last box was inside and Rosalind had gone home to Bethel, I made a pot of coffee, put on my red wool coat, and went out to the porch swing. The swing still creaked on the left side. It had done so since 2011, when the chain bracket had shifted slightly, and Edward had said he would fix it and never quite gotten around to it. I had never had it repaired. It sounded like the house settling into itself, and I had come to think of it as a kind of voice. I sat and drank my coffee and looked out at Olmsted Lane, in the April morning, the pale green beginning in the birch trees, the bluestone walk Edward had laid by hand, the quiet street where nothing was moving yet. 6 days. That was all it had taken from Christmas Eve to the morning Garrett drove away from Rosalind's house on Plumtrees Road. 6 days to unravel something that had been building for years, and 11 weeks to put the legal framework back in order, and 35 years to build the thing that had been worth stealing in the first place. I thought about Edward's letter. I thought about Garrett sitting in the corner of a coffee shop with wet eyes and 3 pages of his father's handwriting in his hands. I thought about Charlene Mobley, who had filmed a Christmas dinner out of instinct and changed the outcome of everything. I thought about what Harold had said the morning we sat in his office on Katuna Street when I had picked up the pen to sign the authorization form and my hand had been steadier than I expected. Document everything. Date and time every call. I had filled 43 pages. The porch swing creaked on the left side as I shifted my weight, and the sound went out across the quiet yard and the pale green birch trees and the April morning, and I let it. I was 60 years old and I was home and the house was mine. That was enough. That had always been enough. People ask me whether I regret fighting back. I don't. I believe God sees what is done in the dark long before any courtroom does. Forgiveness is between me and Him. Justice is between me and the law. Those are two separate things, and I refuse to confuse them. This is grandma revenge in its truest form, not rage, not bitterness, but a 60-year-old woman who kept records, stayed calm, and refused to disappear from her own home. That is raw revenge with steady hands. That is what surviving looks like when you pay attention. Here is my advice: do not wait as long as I did. Know what your name is attached to. Trust, carefully, verify always. The most dangerous betrayals wear familiar faces, and the strongest thing you can do is refuse to be ashamed of surviving them. That was my raw revenge, quiet, legal, and complete. And this grandma revenge cost me 6 days of my life and gave me the rest of it back. If this story moved you, leave a comment, tell me what you would have done. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already, subscribe, because the next story is already waiting. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means everything. A gentle note: some stories on this channel contain fictional elements built for educational purposes. If that is not what you are looking for, no hard feelings, choose what serves you. But if raw revenge and real truth are why you are here, then you are exactly where you belong.